Hi guys, I'm Amber Coles and I'm doing my presentation on the African American Feminist Standpoint Theory or Black Feminist Standpoint Theory. Um, our perception, as far as standpoint, our perception is usually based on our own reality, our own perception of the world. Um, but as from a biblical standpoint, we know that it's based on His own truth. Black women specifically are particularly disadvantaged, thoroughly disadvantaged, if you will. They have a certain complex called the outsider within, which means they are technically within a group, but the group is not necessarily for them. Like they are within the women's group, but they're not. It's not necessarily a group that's all for them. They are within the black community, but not necessarily. They're kind of overlooked within the black community. So we'll explore that a little further, and it'll become a little clearer. But in this presentation, I'll take you through the history of grassroots of feminism into black feminism, into the standpoint theory, and then later on into the two social aspects that I will discuss, which are black women in the arts and black women in literature, black women in the arts and black women in politics, and then on into my conclusion. Um, women's rights, the women's movement actually started with the abolitionist movement. Women would side with their husbands whether to keep slaves or not keep slaves, and there were two prominent women within here that I found within my research. Sarah and Angelina, two sisters, Grimmick, and they were abolitionists. But as 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 say, to summarize, women are supposed to be seen and not heard. They're not necessarily supposed to be speaking in church, which these two women did. They spoke in front of large mixed crowds, to much of the dismay for the clergymen. They didn't actually like that because it went against their principles and what they believe. And so later on, we move into the women's suffrage movement, which is the women's right to vote, Susan B. Anthony and the like fighting for women's right to vote, and then later into the women's liberation movement, which was a fight for women's reproductive rights, which is where we get Roe v. Wade from, and I believe 73. And then last but not least, our ongoing feminist movement of equal pay for equal work. And so that's kind of a brief overview of the feminist movement. Now, moving into black feminism. Now, we usually think of the feminist movement as just specifically being women in general and never factoring in minorities or anything like that. But what I say for this slide, what I say for this part of the presentation, or at least if you're following along with the slides and my presentation, you'll see that on my Black Feminist page, it says that black women were often excluded or segregated from women's movements. So in these marches or in these meetings, either they just weren't allowed to be there, or they had to be in a separate location or separated from the white women. So you would think, because we're all fighting for the same rights, that it would be the same, but not necessarily. And so black women end up creating their own movements. Now, our black feminist movement started with Sojourner Truth in her Ain't I a Woman speech. She, as we all know, was a slave. She gave this speech at a convention in Ohio for women's rights, and she basically was giving her take on the situation of black women being excluded from this movement, and her feeling or her perspective of being a female slave and what she had to go through, and how basically it just wasn't right for them to be, black women in general, to be excluded from said movement. And then later on, because black women were excluded from these movements, they started to create their own, as I said earlier. Ida B. Wells created the founder of the Alpha Suffrage Club. We later have Mary Church Terrell, who was the president of the National Association for Colored Women, or the NACW. And then one woman that I've never learned about before, I've never heard, was Sarah Willie Layton. She went by S. Willie Layton. She was I have to read this, president of the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention. I always get it wrong, so I had to read it. But she was prevalent in helping women get their voices heard within the church, as well as their own rights within the church. And then she also was responsible for helping a lot of disadvantaged young women. So that was her plight in life, to help disadvantaged black women. She also had a very prevalent piece that I saw. She said, "Unsuspecting black girls from the South are a joke to justice." At a lot of times, there would be things that would happen within the black community to these ladies, and it would be often overlooked because they were black women. And that's just the time they lived in at the time. So um, it's not really anybody's fault or anything to that effect, but it just was women's perspective at the time. And then later on, we get moving into the women's liberation movement. At the same time, we had the Black Panther Party movement. Now, the Black Panther Party movement, we just usually think of black power and black people in general. But from some of my research, it's more, especially since I just met Bobby Seale, who is one of the founders of the Black Panther Party. In him telling his story, he mentioned a lot of black males that created this, and a lot of the black male stride within the Black Panther Party. And there was one woman, but she kind of came along after, and she wasn't really a prominent fixture within it. It wasn't Angela Davis, who I'm about to talk about now. But Angela Davis was one of those prevalent women in the Black Panther Party movement who not only spoke for black people in general, but black women. In my research paper, I use an example of her talking about black women versus white women in the housewife complex. At the time, women were thought to stay at home and take care of the kids, but she argued that black women didn't have the luxury of being submissive and having this feminine weakness, as she says, that white women were had that opportunity to do that because they were just staying at home and helping, fixing breakfast and meals and things like that, and doing stuff around the house for their husbands and sons and daughters. But black women actually had to work and then actually had to come home and take care of the household at the same time. So they were doubly disadvantaged in this and didn't have that housewife luxury that their white counterparts did. Now, this is just Davis's perspective of things. Later, we get into the standpoint. We'll talk about standpoint in general and then move down into a Black Feminist Standpoint Theory. Karl Marx was a German philosopher who basically said that the oppressed have special access to knowledge that those in a privileged status do not have. Later on, Sandra Harding took his philosophy and his teachings and made it into the standpoint theory, or the feminist standpoint theory that she theorized in the 60s and the 70s. That basically said people at the bottom of a social hierarchy have a unique standpoint on certain research questions and social problems, and they can help solve those problems because of their disadvantage. Now, enter Patricia Hill Collins, who theorized the Black Feminist Standpoint Theory that basically says that all women don't have the same commonality. Each woman is different based on their location. Now, we shouldn't focus on standpoint just being about perspective and location, but how it relates, but more so how these perspective and their location relate to a larger part of the society. And so, women in the arts and women in politics. We'll start with the women in arts. I adore rap and hip hop music, and if you list, there's a lot of male. It's a very male-dominated field, very misogynistic. So there are very few females within the rap community, but these particular voices, like Queen Latifah's UNITY, which condemned the use of the B word, and Salt-N-Pepa's Let's Talk About Sex, which was talking about HIV and AIDS and protective sex, basically, which was kind of taboo at the time because it was late 80s, early 90s, and no one was really speaking on things like that, were very helpful to that black woman who was listening to these ladies talk about their strides and things that happened to them at any given time. So it was something that was unique within this very misogynistic type of art that black women were able to rise from. And then black women in literature. We have a couple people, Shang, I won't say her first name because I know I'm going to butcher it, with for Color Girls, for Color Girls Who's Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Wasn't Enough, Zora Neale Hurston with her story of Their Eyes Are Watching God, and Maya Angelou's I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings. I actually own 2 of those books. Zora Neale Hurston and her story of her very unique story of a woman by the name of Janie who grew up in Eatonville. She has 3 unique perspectives, one from her being a small a naive, innocent girl to being the first lady of a town, and to then being this liberated, free woman who had finally found love. If you read the story, it'll make a little bit more sense about her humble beginnings to then her being the mayor's first lady, and then her husband dying, the mayor, and then her actually finding her true love and her true purpose in life. And then Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because of it telling her story from a child, small child being sexually molested, not speaking for a couple years, and then, finding her love and finding her voice and becoming this famed poet that we all know and love. And then women in politics. We've had a few strides for black women in politics. Shirley Chisholm, Condoleezza Rice, Carol Moseley Braun, who you all see in my presentation with their titles. But these women are very few and far between. There are not a lot of them, and as Karl Marx had said, those who are oppressed have a unique perspective on the world. And so, because women make up a larger portion of the world, and because black women make up, black women and black people in general make up a larger portion of the minority, because we don't have those adequate voices within these political fields, we lack political representation, which not only is a disadvantage to us, but a disadvantage to any minority, because if we are the largest minority that's being disadvantaged, then there are other smaller minorities that also are not being represented that can benefit from a black woman or a black man, but black woman specifically for my presentation, being in a political office to actually make that change. And so, in a basic sense, like I was saying, black women in certain aspects of different social hierarchies can not only help us as black women or black people, it can also help other minorities who are at disadvantage and don't have those political voices. So it's just something to think about. I know you guys will be reviewing my presentation. I hope it was thorough enough, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll be waiting for your reviews, and thanks so much, guys. I've had such a great time in this class.